Coming to you live from WRUE in Tennessee. It's the Scribbling Woman.
Hi, I'm Nancy Rue. I am a scribbling woman, and so are you, and that's why we're having this conversation. Here we talk about the writerly life that is unique to you, no matter your age, your season, or where you are in your creative process. You are now officially a scribbly, so let's talk. In this season, we've been looking at setting our writerly intentions, not goals or resolutions, but simply those things that allow us to move forward to where we want to be. And in doing that, we've also been talking about loosening our grip on the things that stand in our way. And it seems to me that if we're going to do that, we need to eliminate certain words from the writerly life vocabulary. Words like self discipline, determination, going for it, getting her done. It just seems to me that those are the very words that stand in the way of us letting go of what stands in our way. So here's what that looks like for a writer, I think. It's that time when you sit down and you say, okay, I have 2 hours and dadgummit, I'm going to write 8 pages. And I'm going to sit here and I'm not going to get up for anything. I'm not going to answer my phone. I'm not going to see why the dog's barking. I'm not even going to go get up if I have to pee. Gee, that sounds like fun. Doesn't it sound like fun to get an idea as you're sitting there trying to make this happen, but you can't go with it because this is the plan? No, that's not a good time. That's not creativity. That's not the writerly life. I can say that because I actually used to do that. In my heyday, I used to write 15 pages a day. It didn't matter what else was going on. If I had to skip exercise, if I had to cancel arrangements with friends and family just to get those 15 pages written, if I sat there until I had to pee like a racehorse, I would eat meals at my desk, breakfast, lunch, even dinner, if I could get away with it. Yeah, I published a lot of books. I reached a lot of people, and I certainly reaped the financial rewards. But at what cost? Because at one point, about 4 years ago, maybe longer, I ended up in a Workaholics Anonymous program. I'm not even kidding you. That is a real thing. And if you know anything about 12-step programs, you know that step 2 reads like this. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. That sounds to me like the opposite of self-control, self-discipline, being a control freak. That is what we're going to talk about today. Not a spiritual mugging, but that something greater than ourselves that allows us to let go of determination and fortuitousness and simply be our authentic, creative, writerly selves. Now, that looks different for everyone. Some people might disagree with me on that, but truly, I'm not going to be talking about it's this way or it's wrong. That limits the power of the higher power. It puts it in a box where it doesn't belong. So, this belief in something beyond ourselves that actually moves the pen across the page can run the full gamut from, well, there's something out there, I can feel it, to this is absolutely what I believe in. It's anything from a deep knowing to an actual set of beliefs. It's being anything from vaguely conscious of it to really feeling like you're being guided. Now, that doesn't water it down. Certainly, my own experience is pretty firm. I'm very much a God believer in a very universal sense. What I'm asking you to do is consider this higher power in your writerly life in the light of your experience with the great beyond. Now, what does this have to do with the writerly life? Well, let's look at that same situation we talked about earlier in a different way. All right, so you sit down, got some time, you're going to write. Well, at first, your computer's doing something weird and you're kind of itchy and you wish you hadn't worn this sweater, but you write the first sentence. Not your best, but you're going to continue. You write another sentence. and another. And you're writing a paragraph, and a scene is unfolding. And suddenly you realize you do have to pee because 90 minutes have gone by, and you look at what you've written and you're not quite sure where it exactly came from. We can talk about that as being in the zone, but in my view, something else took over. It happens to me at least once every time I'm working on a project. I'm just going to give you two examples. Once was in my very first book for tweens. It was the debut novel of the Christian Heritage series. And Josiah, my protagonist, is walking down the road, had everything all planned and knew exactly what was going to happen. And suddenly, from out of the woods, stepped what they called in the 17th century an Indian squaw. She was not in the outline. I had not researched her, but suddenly there she was. Josiah followed her, and so did I. And she became an integral part of those first 6 books. Now, fast forward about 10 years, and I was going through the darkest episode of clinical depression. And at the same time, I was on deadline to finish Healing Stones, one of my novels for grown-up people. I didn't know how I was going to do that because I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I could barely decide what I was going to put on my body. My confidence was at an all-time low. There's so much shame and guilt involved in depression, even if it's not your fault. But I had a deadline, and somehow writing kept me sane. It was a reason to show up every day. So I sat down and I closed my eyes and I said, God, you're going to have to help me with this. And then I would write. And the next day I would come back to that after not having slept very well and thought, where did that come from? Who wrote that? I don't even remember putting those words down. That's how most of that book was written. No one will ever convince me that in those instances and in many others, a higher power didn't have something to do with that. So let's consider 3 possibilities for how that might work in anybody's writing life. The first would be the call. And usually we associate that with I'm called to be a nun or a priest or even to be a doctor or to be a missionary. But let's look at it this way. Ponder a couple of questions. Why do you write? What is it that keeps you showing up again and again? What compels you to write what you write? And maybe most important, how do you feel when you're not following that nudge, when you do other things because they seem more practical? How does that come to us? For some people, it's really audible. I'm not one to clearly hear the voice of God on a regular basis. Some people do. For some, it's more a feeling or a knowing. That's how it works for me. For most of us, we just see it in retrospect. Oh my gosh, I was supposed to write that. That's why I kept doing it, even if it made absolutely no sense. Name it whatever you will, but be aware that the call comes from someplace beyond ourselves. Now, the second is inspiration. I love the fact that the word inspire comes from the Latin word inspirare, which means to breathe into. I kind of love the sense of God is breathing stuff into me, and I'm just letting it flow out onto the page. So where do you think your ideas come from? How do characters appeal to you? How does the plot unfold or the structure? How is it that you meet that right random person in the line at Starbucks who says just the right thing that moves you forward? Why is it that just when you're about to throw in the towel on the whole writerly thing, somebody messages you on Facebook and says, I read your blog and I think you're amazing? You can call it, again, whatever you want to. Serendipity, synchronicity, manifesting, the hand of God. It truly does not all come from here. We would do well to pay attention to that and not just depend on ourselves. And thirdly, I think the spiritual aspect of writing comes to us in kairos time. Now, the ancient Greeks had 2 concepts of time. One was chronos, And that's the one that we're familiar with. That's the days, the weeks, the months measured by the clock and the calendar. It's that winged chariot that's always at our back. It continues on at its own speed no matter what we do. Kairos time, on the other hand, is more qualitative than quantitative. It's when suddenly you know this is the right time for this. Whether it makes any sense or not, I'm going to follow it. And as I go, I'm going to, as author Angela Hunt puts it, expect the unexpected. It's the good and proper time for an action. And whether rhetorically speaking, it's correct to say this, I think that's the zone that we talked about in our example. Time ceases to matter. We simply enter into Kairos. So how do we loosen our grip and let the call and the inspiration and the Kairos time work? This is our part in that. And again, I think there's a magic 3. The first is that we just ask. Whether for you that's prayer or journaling or simply taking a walk and letting ideas come to you, whether it's meditation, we simply ask for what we need. Now, I'm not talking about things with specific outcomes. I'm not one to pray for a parking place and then thank God because it happened just when I need it to, when I'm busy and I don't have time to roam around the parking lot. So I'm not talking about God, please make people buy my book. Lord, find me an agent. Holy Spirit, make people come to my social media venues. First of all, if we do that, I mean, you can do that and that's perfectly fine. It doesn't hurt anything except that when that doesn't happen, what do we do? So God, what? Did you lose my address? I think it makes more sense to align what we ask for with our intentions. May I find my authentic voice. May I be shown what I'm to write about and who I'm to write for. May I have the courage to put my voice out there. I think it's good to pray in our own voice or to ask in a way that's genuine for us. It doesn't have to be churchy. It doesn't have to sound all spiritual. It's simply a conversation with something out there that really cares about us and what we do. And then secondly, once we ask, then we need to pay attention to what happens. Not expecting every single detail to fall into place, but just consciousness of what we asked for, being alert to it. For example, back in 2016, when what I had known as my career in the Christian publishing world seemed to be sort of petering out, I wasn't sure what to do next. And I was riding along one day, driving my car, listening to NPR, and there was a story about the fact that the United States Supreme Court had just ruled that the mandatory sentence for minors convicted of first-degree murder was no longer in place. It was up to the states to decide what they wanted to do about that, and it could even be retroactive. I listened intently as they talked about Massachusetts being the very first state to decide to go back and review all of those cases for those convicted who had been in prison for at least 15 years and had no hope of ever getting parole. They were going to die in prison, even for some crime they committed when they were 17. And the story was about the families of the victims, how they felt about someone who had killed their loved one being released from prison or given parole. And that idea would not leave me alone. Almost 10 years later, I just released a novel based on that called More Than a Footnote. That was an answer to a prayer, even though it took seemingly forever for it to come to fruition. Pay attention. Be conscious. The answers are there. And finally, take the risk. Now, writing itself is an act of courage. And allowing our writing to be seen by other people takes a huge amount of bravery. So it's a risk in itself. The kind of risk that I'm talking about, in addition to that, is not stupid things like, okay, I have a rough draft. It's not there yet, but I'm going to go ahead and send it to a New York agent. That isn't gutsy. That's just a waste of time. But other things are not. Other acts of courage might be, okay, this is not ready. I need a mentor. That's a little bit risky. What if they tell me I just don't have what it takes? And yet you still email Nancy Rue and say, who do you recommend? You go to the Scribbling Women and say, anybody up for coaching me a little bit on this? You are taking the risk because you've been led, you've been called, and now is the Kairos time. It's taking the risk when opportunities come up that you think, really? Is this for real? I'm going to give you one final example. I was writing a teen novel called Tournaments, Coco, and One Wrong Move. And it was about a young high school basketball player. She was going for a scholarship. She was amazing, and she tore her ACL. Well, I have a habit of writing about things about which I know nothing. And I was kind of struggling with that a little bit. And one night I was with my family in a Mexican restaurant, and at another table, there was a group of young women, tall young women, and all of them had Vanderbilt basketball t-shirts on. One of them got up and went into the restroom, and something said, follow her. So I went into the restroom, and as the two of us are washing our hands, I said to her, so I see you're a basketball player. I happen to be writing a novel, blah, blah, blah. And this gal tears her ACL. Do you know anybody? Can you give me any insights? Our eyes met in the mirror, and she said, I tore my ACL freshman year. I would love to help you with this. I said, can I email you? She said, you know what? We're having a pickup game tomorrow. Why don't you come? So I went, I watched, I took her to dinner. We emailed, we were on the phone several times, and she made that book what it turned out to be. Now that's taking a risk. I could have been arrested as a stalker. But somehow that higher power protects us and says, go for it. None of us does this writerly living completely on our own. If we try, we end up with less than our freest, our best, our most authentic. We can't loosen our grip on our own. It requires the quiet power of something larger and wiser and more creative than we are, no matter what we name it. I'm praying for you, Scribblies. And until next time, scribble on.